Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. Before we get started, I would like each of the panelists to introduce themselves in terms of their background and where they come from so that the audience knows more about you. We'll start with Jess.
Thank you. My name is Jessica Furr. I'm here from Dragonfly Capital. We are a crypto-focused venture capital firm. And like this industry, we're kind of decentralized. We're located everywhere and nowhere. I'm based out of Miami. And my background is I've been a venture capital lawyer for the last 9 years, worked at Gunderson Detmer prior to starting at Dragonfly. I'm excited to be here today.
Great. Well, thanks for having me again to Hashed and Jin. My background also, I'm a lawyer. I practiced in law for about 10 years, securities laws. I was a capital markets lawyer, working with different jurisdictions through my career, and then I shifted into becoming a tech entrepreneur. And I am currently the EIR entrepreneur in residence at Hashed, building an AI-powered platform to help crypto projects become more transparent and become compliant with certain key regulations that are coming down the pipeline, like MiCA, which you've heard a lot about. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Great. Since we have an intimate setting, I want to do a quick survey of the audience. How many of you are lawyers or legal-related people? So a lot of lawyers. Founders? Oh, founder. Okay, founders. Okay. And just shout out if you're something else. And okay, sounds good. Okay, that's a good survey. All right, so given that the topic is about decentralization, I wanted to start off by saying that the word really came into focus when former Director Hinman of the US Securities Exchange Commission said that Bitcoin and Ethereum are sufficiently decentralized, so therefore they may not be securities. However, we haven't really had a good legal definition of what that decentralization means. So let's start off with what that word means to you, Jess.
Yeah, I think of decentralization in two facets, one being technological and the other being legal, as I'm a lawyer. And so when I think of decentralization in that way, I'm thinking a lot about, is there a lack of intermediary? Is there a need for disclosure from a centralized managerial authority, or is it such that management has been turned over to the community and the community is controlling the project? So those are the kind of my points of it.
Yeah, I think decentralization obviously has different sort of meanings in the space. You get the sort of ethos of blockchain and the decentralized world of the ideals of projects and transactions that are just ran by the community. But then there's also how the law looks at decentralization and how they're sort of trying to give this a definition. For me, I don't like thinking about these things as so defined yet. I think the space is sort of trying to find its way, trying to find exactly what the balance is with decentralization. But obviously, the idea here is that there is definitely less control of an intermediary in blockchain, and that's where decentralization really kind of turns.
Okay, so let us be a little bit more concrete. Jess, I had a great time reading through your comment letter submitted to the IRS, which is a federal tax authority in the US, about arguing against the expansion of the definition of a broker who offer facilitative services or access to autonomously executing transactions on a protocol. Could you walk us through some of the pillars of your argument and why you made those arguments?
Well, I think it's the first time someone used the word tax and exciting in the same sentence. At Dragonfly, we care a lot about our portfolio companies, and a lot of our portfolio are DeFi projects. And the IRS came out with this new tax rule proposed recently, which would probably kill DeFi in the US, and basically expanded the broker definition to include anyone who facilitates directly or indirectly any kind of digital asset transaction. So that could mean software developer, that could mean a coder, that could mean front-end protocol itself. It's incredibly broad and not well defined. And so we were really concerned about that. When we wrote to the IRS, we tried to make the argument, when you look at some other FinCEN regulations that have come out, we differentiate between a service provider and a software developer. So a service provider has customers, they control assets, they custody assets. A software provider doesn't custody assets. They're allowing P2P transactions to take place. And so that's the argument that we were trying to make to the IRS, that if you are providing software, you're facilitating something that allowing two people to do something directly without going through an intermediary, it would be way too onerous and burdensome to impose the collection of names, social security numbers, ID, all the transactions for software developers. That's not what they do. They'd have to essentially change their code, and that would just kill projects in the US. So it remains to be seen what happened. There's been a huge outpour. I think 44,000 letters have been written, which is actually an impressive way to stall regulation, is to impose all these comment letters, because each one has to be read. So, but we're trying to think about decentralization. If something is super decentralized, the way software is, and you have P2P transactions, they're not intermediaries. They're not taking custody. They're, putting that kind of a burdensome regulation, it just makes no sense.
Great. And I think that distinction between service providers and then product developers, I think that distinction is quite key in the overall conversation. Moving to you, Alejandro, I know that you recently came from Europe, and in the MiCA, they've done a more tech-informed approach when it comes to how they're thinking about the ones that they want to regulate. So for instance, in Recital 22, it talks about exempting CASPs or crypto asset service providers who are fully decentralized, or issuers that do not have identifiable issuers from the scope of the regulation. Could you tell us some of the learnings and takeaways from your European tour, and also what is the intent behind this exemption?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually a very kind of hot topic right now in discussion, and people are overreading that particular recital to try to figure out exactly what it means, this fully decentralized point. And we had the chance to actually sit down and have dinner with Peter Kirstens, who actually drafted MiCA, and I just asked him the question directly: what is the meaning of that particular recital, and what does it mean to be fully decentralized? And he basically said, and I quote, "It doesn't mean anything." and that's the problem. I mean, the regulators in the EU, though, they've been really smart about this, because they basically, their stance right now is that they don't have enough information to really make a choice here on how to regulate that particular space. And so the idea of putting that in there is just to say, we're going to wait and see. We're going to give this space a little bit more time. They don't see DeFi being big enough right now to be a primary concern for the EU, and so they're just giving themselves some time to learn, which I think is the smart thing to do, instead of sort of trying to clamp down and perhaps kind of damaging the development of that particular space. So in the EU, we're seeing the timeline being by the end of 2024, the European Commission needs to issue a report, like with consultation with the EBA and ESMA, to the European Parliament on DeFi specifically. And so we won't really see DeFi regulation coming from the EU until after December 2024. That's going to take them a while. So my guess is that maybe second half of 2025, we're going to have some more clarity on DeFi and whether or not it's even going to be regulated under MiCA. So it's an interesting thing. I think for now, DeFi projects in the EU are safe. But again, that clause is meant to also just trigger the registration of the ones that are unsure whether or not they're properly DeFi. So the EU's also by putting fully decentralized, unlike the sufficiently decentralized stance of the US, for example, is, hey, if you're sure that you're fully DeFi, that's cool. Keep doing what you're doing. We'll figure you out later. But if you kind of have doubts about it, then the regulation is really kind of pushing you to get a license in the EU in order to be properly operate within the region.
Great. So slightly moving the conversation away from the service providers. I think crucial element in the overall decentralization topic is the role of a DAO. And I think in the US context, for instance, the DAO has been very prevalent in terms of the Howey test, in terms of defining common enterprise, whether there is one, there isn't. Can you walk us through some of the important and relevant incidents that have happened in the US that, that would speak to the role of a DAO in the overall decentralization topic?
Yeah, I would say the one that really stands out is UkiDAO, which is there was an action brought by the CFTC against the DAO, and what they ultimately settled, but made the argument that is if you had tokens, you were a member of the UkiDAO, and therefore were severally and jointly liable for the actions of the project itself. So it's a problem when you don't pick a legal entity. I think that's kind of the big takeaway from UkiDAO. You know, with DAOs, it's kind of hard because there's no legal definition. It's what is it, when is it actually formed? Is it when you hold the token? Is it when something converts in time, an event? It's kind of, it's not so clear. But when you don't choose a legal entity, there is the risk of what happened with UkiDAO, that the law will default to what is the assumption that you're a partnership and you'll be jointly and separately liable as a member of that partnership. So, you know, I think the big lesson for developers, for founders, is talk to your lawyers and think about what kind of legal structure is best for you, whether that's an LLC, the Dash Business Trust in New Zealand, or an unincorporated nonprofit. There's many different types of entities. A joint partnership, or a joint venture is another thing that may be a way to go, but that's really the takeaway.
Just to add on my personal take on the UkiDAO, it was a settlement. So I think there is a little bit of danger for the industry to think that this is actually an applicable legal precedent, but this was a settlement. And so I think there are reverberating and remaining issues that remain. So Alejandro, what's your take on this issue?
For me, I mean, back to the point on the right way and perhaps wrong way of regulating this, I think the SEC and the CFTC in the US and their approach, it's doing a disservice really to the industry. They're falling in a gray area where they're not giving enough clarity on these issues, while at the same time going after with enforcement actions, even of regular individuals that are perhaps in a DAO without having a clue that they had any sort of liability in relation to what they were doing. So for me, and this question that the US has sort of posed so centrally in their regulatory process in trying to regulate crypto, of whether you're decentralized or not decentralized, I don't think is the right conversation. And unfortunately, even the SEC, with the release of the framework of analysis of investment contracts for digital assets, which was basically the SEC's attempt to clarify the Howey test for crypto projects, it really doesn't provide enough background. It just says, it clarifies this fourth prong of the Howey test as being, if you have an active participant, right? And that's defined as a sponsor or a promoter or any third party or group of third parties, which is extremely vague and broad, then you are not decentralized. But this is why the SEC has taken such a harsh approach on this and said really only Bitcoin and perhaps Ethereum are fully decentralized. So that to me is just going in a direction that is making the space work toward that goal, which is not really what they should be doing. I think the focus for projects in the space should be to develop great technology, solutions, functionality. Perhaps the important thing is really worrying about consumer protection and being transparent about how you do things and communicating, but not trying to basically fit into these rubrics of whether or not you are decentralized or not decentralized. Because we've gotten into a game of like smokes and mirrors where every single project out there is trying to do things that they think the SEC is going to consider to be decentralized. So for me, the US approach is a little bit dangerous, but as advice, of course, one can advise to kind of look at certain things. I think the important thing for projects is, if you really want to avoid being considered centralized, just make sure you have a roadmap to decentralization. And there's many things that you can do along the way, and you can set that up from the beginning. I don't think it's realistic for you to do it from the very beginning, because you're definitely going to be more dependent on a group of people. But once you have a roadmap and you start setting up the different pieces, there is a potential of becoming decentralized if that is actually your goal. But I don't think it's worth making that your goal simply because the SEC is telling you to do it.
Great. So I wanted this to be a very practical session for the audience as well. Jess, you must have had a plethora of experience of due diligencing a lot of portfolio companies that you've invested in. What are some of the best practices that you've seen in the market that you thought were really good? And what were some of the no-nos that you've seen that you really would warn founders against? We'd love to hear from your experience.
Yeah, I think that when you're a founder, you want to just make sure everything is clean right before you're going to go out and raise money. So make sure that your cap table is accurate. Make sure you tick and tie that out. That all the IP is properly assigned to the company. You transfer your URLs to the company itself. For this space, we want to make sure that you're thinking about things regulatory-wise. We don't expect you to have the answers because there's no answers, right? There's a lot of gray. So just have a good answer, and we'll help you as you are working through everything regulatorily. Making sure you've got good counsel lined up as well that has a knowledge of the space. There are a lot of lawyers that open up a shingle and they say they're crypto lawyers, but they're really not crypto lawyers, and that's a problem because you need people who are really willing to dig in and kind of chew on these issues. It's not so simple, making sure that thinking about AMLs and KYC stuff. We always do background checks on our founders. So if we see somebody on the cap table that is going to be a problem for FinCEN or OFAC, that's going to be a big no-no. And also just don't bribe any foreign officials, because that's a big red line.
Thank you. And Alejandro, as a founder doing tell us a little bit about Mooncheck and how you're trying to help the founders become more compliant.
Okay, so Mooncheck, as I sort of alluded to earlier, it's an AI-powered platform to allow crypto projects to become compliant with MiCA, but really the idea here and the vision is just to allow them to be more transparent, because to me, that's really what matters the most, is sort of like the consumer protection from, hey, here's all that we do very transparently. So the platform itself is actually extremely centralized, and because we didn't want to get caught in that distinction. That said, we're also not planning on issuing a token right now. We're not discounting the possibility of becoming more decentralized in the future, but at the beginning, we also needed to have conversations with regulators, and that's what we've been doing as well in Europe to be able to make this a proper conduit for a certain degree of compliance in the region. But the idea behind Mooncheck is really just to walk a project step by step through a process of due diligence that normally would be conducted by a lawyer, and for the AI then to issue a draft disclosure that complies with the white paper requirements of MiCA. White paper is just a name that they gave it because it fits the space, but it is just disclosure as any lawyer would kind of consider disclosure for the lawyers out there. So that's what the AI does. But what we've changed, and where it does have a little bit of an aspect of decentralization, is that we're changing how disclosure is consumed by the public. We're allowing the community to come in and interact with the disclosure in a different way and provide feedback to the crypto projects that are on the platform for them to start identifying where they can also improve that disclosure. Because we do think that the community is pretty smart in blockchain, and they're looking at everything that you're doing. Many of them are looking at your GitHub, they've read everything you have out there, they're looking at your Discord channels. So they're sometimes in the best position to kind of come back and say, hey, can you clarify this? Like this point in your disclosure is not really quite accurate. So opening it up is a way of sort of decentralizing a little bit of that feedback loop, and for them to be able to continuously improve the disclosure, because that's what really the law is requiring of them right now, is for them to have like a live white paper that anything that's changing, you have to be updating it constantly. And we do think that the community is going to play a big role there.
And I think that's really key to understanding what decentralization means, because the flip side of it, I think, is the empowerment of individuals and consumers at the end, for them to practice their agencies, to have influence in important decision-making process. And so, as promised, I would like to open up the last 5 minutes of the sessions for questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? No questions. Oh, yes.
Question to Jess. How do you diligence a project where the founder is kind of anon or pseudo anon? Like, I'm thinking of Blast, which Paradigm backed recently. So how do you take a call there? Because I mean, sometimes the commercial team will be like, hey, we want to do this, sign here.
I think that the way venture capital firms may go about doing this would be multiple ways. One, recommendations are really important. So if you can point, if you're an anonymous founder or pseudo-anonymous founder, and you can point to other people that are known in the space and say they can vouch for you, that's one thing that I know people will do. Sometimes things happen behind closed doors. I've heard of people going to the offices directly and meeting, and so there's not a paper trail to protect the founder if they're in certain countries where it's illegal to be involved in crypto. But it's a really hard space. I think when you're a venture capitalist, you have to decide whether the bet's important. Is you either risk and take a bet or you don't. And so if you don't take that bet, is that worth it? What's your LP? What are your investors? Who are your clients, your customers? What do they want you to do? Are they paying for you? Are they investing in you to take that risk? And so that's the question I think that you would want to ask.
Good evening, panelists. I'm Subha, and my question is, we've all agreed that a decentralized entity, burdening it with compliance requirements is a little too onerous. So where does liability come in? How do we hold somebody liable if something goes wrong, or a decentralized infrastructure or a product is used by a bad element? How do we do that?
That's a great question, and it's a question that we were just discussing a minute ago before coming in. It is one of the most difficult areas, because naturally regulators are going to try to identify someone, and for that reason, I personally think that the space should not be afraid of making sure they have entities that actually protect them from that. Because as we've seen with OkiDAO, I mean, it could fall even onto DAO token holders that voted on one issue a certain degree of liability. To your point, though, I think from a crypto project standpoint, I think you just need to really always be thinking of consumer protection, right? I think that is the basis of everything. And the regulators are going to be worried more about that than anything else. So I think also just being on the right side of that spectrum, it's very, very helpful. But then I actually do suggest the projects not to be afraid of having entities of limited liability that ultimately protect them, because I do not think that they're mutually exclusive with the concept of decentralization and running a protocol in a decentralized manner. But regulators are going to go after someone if they cannot find that.
If you could just maybe expand a little bit on how making an entity is actually not different from decentralization, because from how I understand it, the moment you have something governing you, you're not really decentralized, are you?
Well, not really, because the thing is that it all comes down to your governance structure, right? You can still have all of the decision-making in regards to that particular entity be done by the DAO. So as long as you actually have structures that allow them to, for example, pick who the director is, fire them whenever they want to, and have pretty clear steps for that, all run by the DAO, I don't think necessarily that having the entity itself means you're centralized.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Hi, this is Gaurav Mehta. I represent Katax crypto auditing firm, practicing for more than 5 years now, primarily with the government. So I have been talking a lot with the government, and one thing that we as a government, I'm trying to say struggle is, everyone claims in the space that, let's say example, Uniswap is a decentralized. But out there in the Uniswap labs, there are two folks who are holding a key. At any point of time, they are able to change the codes, distribute it. So is it fair to call it a decentralized, or is it fair to call it a distributed infrastructure managed by the centralized entity? Because the arguments have come again and again. If any central person has an excess, it cannot be called decentralized. So what are your thoughts? And that I see is the biggest barrier, because when the largest organization is not decentralized, forget about everything else.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think maybe the subtlety here to understand is that decentralization isn't like one thing. I think it's a spectrum, right? So maybe there's different points in a life cycle of a project. Maybe they start out fully centralized and they go decentralized, more decentralized over time. Uniswap is partly there. I think that they have a DevCo. The DevCo has transferred their IP, like the trademarks, like the registered IP to, I think, the foundation. But if the centralized entity still has like a control of the keys, I think to your point, it's not fully decentralized. I think it's partly decentralized.
Yeah, and if I may add something to that, because that's a very common problem, right? And I think decentralization right now is still highly theoretical for the majority of the space, right? So there's these practical points where you're going to find points of centralization that the space is actually trying to figure out how to clean up. But that's why I also think that the space is finding where in the spectrum it's actually going to fall eventually from a practical standpoint.
And DAOs are really evolving in this space too, right? I mean, before we thought they were sort of modeled on corporations, corporate law, and democracy. If everyone just votes all the time, it's going to be great. But you all have lives and things to do, so it's hard to do that all the time. And so now what you're seeing with MakerDAO, for example, is what they have sub-DAOs, or there's experimentation now with kind of Machiavellian models of voting, where maybe there's a committee of people that have some control, but they can be voted out by everyone else in the DAO. So I think that it's very early in the DAO space. I think what we saw initially is just based on what already existed. So I think that people will still innovate in the space, and we're going to kind of figure out how to get to the ideal decentralization model, I think, eventually. But we want to have time and space to do that. So hopefully nobody overregulates it out of existence.
And speaking of time, we've run out. Thank you for your time, both Jess and Alejandro, and for the audience as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Guys, let's